Hello and welcome to our Sustainability Speaks talk. I'm Don B from the Department of Philosophy. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Adam Briggle from the University of North Texas. Professor Briggle is an engaged field philosopher. And I think you'll learn today that field philosophy has a lot in common with the spirit of Mitchell Center's community-facing engaged research. I've had the chance to get to know Adam over pack rafting this morning in a discussion in an environmental justice seminar last night, where Adam shared his view that philosophy should be about taking account of more things. I think that's something we try to do here and we'll get to do together today. Adam's engaged in sustainability, but in reflecting on what we're sustaining in the conditions of a good life. He works in tracking and energy philosophy, philosophy of technology and science, and environmental ethics. He holds a PhD from the University of Colorado in environmental studies and did a postdoc at the University of Twente, the Netherlands. He'll introduce more of his work to you, and I'll leave that to him. But he's been generous with his time and is hosting a few more events here, including a talk tomorrow at 4 o'clock for the philosophy department at Winslow Hall, Winslow 201 at 4 o'clock. The talk is entitled 4 Theories of Climate Change, which will complement but be a little bit different than the talk on engaged research today. And Friday morning, there will be a couple of events hosted by the Mitchell Center and our new main sustainability hub, MESH. First at 9 o'clock in the Mitchell Center, we'll have a meeting for students involved in environmental activism, climate change activism on campus. So if you're curious about that or would like to network, that will be not just a chance to talk with Dr. Briggle, but to work and network with other groups on campus and learn a little bit and get involved with MESH. And at 11 o'clock, to cap off his visit, we'll go for a forest walk and a nature walk around campus. So you can RSVP for those events. We have information. Just get in touch with us after. And I present to you, Dr. Adam Briggle.
All right, thank you so much. I want to thank the Mitchell Center, University of Maine, the philosophy department, and especially Don for inviting me out here and taking your time. It's really an honor to be here. It's a pleasure. So what I've done is prepared. Oh, I should also thank, well, now not even this button works. Hold on. There we go. I have about 20 slides, and I'm wondering if Don, if you wouldn't mind, or somebody, in case I get lost, give me like a 35-minute warning, because I'd like to cut myself off at 40 so that we have time for discussion. And my understanding is there's going to be a continued discussion after this. Is that right? So hopefully what I can do is at least sort of get things going by sharing my ideas. Okay, so here's the outline. I broke this down into 4 parts. Oh yeah, I want to thank my grad students because I did an early version of this talk and they helped me trim it down. I wanted to focus it. So that was very helpful. I put up a cover of my book with Bob Frodeman, my colleague, Socrates Tenured. If you're interested in this would be a good place to go. I can get you a PDF of that book if you want. Just don't tell the publisher. Just email me. You can find me. So I'm going to talk about the opportunity space for philosophy, the way I think of philosophy as a thing that exists in the world, in which way it exists. Then I'll give you an example of my own work in field philosophy, doing fracking stuff in Dept, Texas, just to kind of put something concrete on it before I talk about it as a model more abstractly, a model for community engaged research. And then I have the last 2 slides on kind of my ideas for a research agenda, just in case there's a provost or somebody in the upper administration lurking in the audience somewhere, and they want some ideas for restructuring universities and the humanities in particular. I'll share some of those ideas. So that's the kind of outline. Okay, first, the opportunity space. I think philosophy is everywhere, basically, and it's kind of unavoidable. So I was going to put the fancy philosophic terms for these questions, like this would be metaphysics or ontology, but I think the questions themselves are more important. So I just wanted to list some questions that I think almost no matter what the community is engaged with or wrestling with or has a controversy about, these kind of questions will show up in one way or another. right? So in other words, field philosophy is not bringing philosophy to something that was not there. Philosophy wasn't there before. It's trying to articulate and draw it out what's already there, you know? So questions about what exists, questions about knowledge, what we know, how knowledge is related to politics and policy, how it gets used or maybe abused in those processes, how people make meaning out of a barrage of experiences that we have. I think rhetoric is really important, how situations get framed in contested landscapes, the way people will define it in different ways, the way problems get framed. Questions of logic and how arguments are made and whether they're sound. Aesthetics. I did a study of the Nantucket Sound wind farm, and I think that entire controversy was about aesthetics, even though people weren't talking about that explicitly. They were using economics and science and technology as a stalking horse to really talk about a sense of place and a sense of beauty and what belongs at a place. Those are all philosophic perennial themes. Ethics, who we are, how we should live, what we should do, always come up. And political philosophy about power and who has responsibility. So all of that is there, I think, and no matter what kind of community endeavor you want to get involved in. So those are abstract questions, some examples. I've only been here 2 days, but I'm already fascinated with this recent legal case study that we've been talking about with the Penobscot Nation about what is an island and what is a river. It strikes me that that is a really interesting legal ontological debate that I know nothing about, but it sort of struck me that's right there. That's a metaphysical question that's trying to be resolved. This is something I do teach in my classes. I don't know if you all have followed geoengineering or climate interventions. What about putting sulfates into the atmosphere? The big question that people are researching. I think there's an ethics of whether we should even research that or not at stake. One of my colleagues who does field philosophy, her name is Evelyn Brister. She works with American chestnut restoration, and she's dealing with philosophical questions that arise around when you genetically engineer something, does it change it in such a way that it's no longer natural? Is it artificial? Does it still count as restoring a tree if it's been genetically engineered? One of my projects was early in my career, wind front and then sound. I'm really interested in this now. What's the future of food? Lab-grown meat, which has just been, I think, prohibited in Italy as a sort of threat, perceived threat to the culture. But others are arguing this is the future of food. And precision fermentation, something I'm learning about, which raises interesting questions that harken back to my bioethics days with the yuck factor. So there's kind of an aesthetics of this too, because this is essentially eating bacteria. But it could reduce our land area for agriculture by orders of magnitude. Right? So these are just a few examples, but it's just to say philosophy is everywhere. I'll say a little bit about, I think philosophers have a demand side problem in a large part, because our culture doesn't think about these sorts of things as philosophic issues. And it's pretty apparent by the way we talk in our culture. And I'm using our culture broadly because I've already learned Maine is quite clearly different than Texas in many ways. But I'm talking about sort of Western modernity in general. Our default language is economics and it's sort of a technological. And so philosophers, I think, are sometimes trying to push a rope, as it were, to try to get in the fray, because we're trying to convince people that, oh, you're already kind of doing what we do, you know? So that's a kind of cultural pathology or something that is sort of beyond my control. But I did just want to mention that. But I think it's changing because science and technology always transcend themselves. The more we try to hive things off into the STEM fields, the more philosophical questions flow and overflow from them. AI is a great example. And I think when I used to work in bioethics, so scholars in that sort of realm of engaged scholarship had a leg up because it was really interesting in that history, beginning in the 70s. people in society came to bioethicists and said, we have ethical problems. So they already recognized them as philosophical or ethical in nature, and we're inviting them in. And what's been interesting talking with Don is it seems like that's happening more often now in other fields, including sustainability, where engineers and scientists are approaching philosophers and saying, we're really best. So I think that demand function is changing. But what I'm going to focus on today is the supply side. That is to say, how philosophy has organized itself and how it will need to change to sort of meet those opportunities out there in society. I do think it's true that if you look at sustainability now, and from what I can tell, this center is maybe an outlier, but in general, people don't think of sustainability as being a humanistic or a philosophic issue or having those components to it. But so it's marginal, but I think it can become more essential if we rethink philosophy. And so that's kind of what I've been trying to do. So that's the kind of the way I think in general. Now, I think this is my last slide on the opportunity space. It's just to ask how these questions appear. So, those questions, what exists, what should we do, who has responsibility, is a chestnut tree still a chestnut tree, right? How they show up is scattershot throughout the soil of whatever issue is going on. It's not an isolatable or isolated thing. And I think that's the challenge. So the space of appearance of philosophy is rhizomatic. That's why I use this image. It's sort of running laterally and crisscrossing through all of these things. It's not an isolated domain of expertise that you could pull out and say, I'm going to be the one to capture this and say something about it. Because once you try to extract it and turn it into a pure philosophic problem, it loses all of the contextual factors that make it so pressing, that make it so relevant. So philosophy needs to adopt that kind of shape. Philosophers have to find those kind of spaces in order to rise to these opportunities. The way this looks in society is what I call the new alphabet of the humanities. These terms like ethics and values studies, EVS, responsible research and innovation, ethical, legal, social implications, broader impacts criteria, that's big. The science of science and innovation policy, or socio-technical integration and research, and I could go on. These are all institutional programs at NSF and other funding agencies and institutions that are finding ways to incorporate humanists, including philosophers, into research programs that are interdisciplinary, but they're not standalone chunks, like a philosophically pure problem. You're going to have to be a member of a team working on a problem, right? That's the opportunity space, institutionally. The problem, and this is what I've been trying to address along with Bob Frodeman, is that for the past 100 years, philosophers have abandoned this rhizomatic self-understanding and have adopted a sort of stovepipe disciplinary self-understanding. That they're going to be another discipline alongside all of the other disciplines. It's kind of a purified laboratory space that they work in. And they're going to have their peer community, fellow philosophers, and that's who they're going to talk to. And as a result, they've drifted into irrelevance. Right at a time over the last 100 years, when science and technology and a growing economy have made such profound philosophical challenges present in society, philosophers have sort of retreated into their discipline. So I'm just trying to bridge that gap. So I do think that the discipline of philosophy is a historical aberration. Socrates was not a professional philosopher. John Locke, not a professional philosopher, he's a medical doctor, kind of seditionist, basically. It's just we're in this weird period that coincides with the rise of the research university, where philosophy's taken on this weird shape. But I think its future is going to have to be something different. Okay, that's the first part one. That's kind of where I think about the shape and the opportunity space. Here's an example, and I'll preface it by saying, not every example of field philosophy needs to be so politically charged as this one became, right? There's so many different versions, and I've tried to give you some examples. The chestnut tree work is a good example as well. But this is me working on, this is a fracking site. This is my home university. This is UNT. There's fracking wells on campus. I snapped this picture when this one was being actively fracked several years ago. And what I'm going to do is take 5 years of my research life and talk to you in 5 slides, just to give you a kind of hint of what this could look like on the ground. But again, it's just one example. It doesn't carry the representational work of what all field philosophy is and can be. So just the part of doing field philosophy is you have to learn a lot of new stuff, right? You're going to have to learn to become, what's the term, a kind of, not a participatory expert, but a kind of, there's another word for an expert who can at least listen in on it, make sense of the expert's conversations. That's what a field philosopher needs to do. So I had to learn a lot about what fracking is. I'd always found this one slide most useful. It is an oil and gas extraction technique from unconventional reservoirs. So in other words, reservoirs where the gas or oil is held in microscopic pores and it will not come out on its own pressure. So you have to do a couple of things. One is you have to get way down deep, because these are usually deeper formations. You have to turn the wellbore horizontally to maximize contact with that production zone. And then you have to, the actual fracturing of it is you have to push enormous amounts of pressurized liquids with grains of sand in it. That's called proppant, to prop open the fractures. So they'll actually explode holes. They'll put explosives down there, blow the pipe open, and then they'll push enormously pressurized liquids and proppant and chemicals in there to create these fissures so that the gas can flow back up. There's a big, as you saw in the picture, a big surface imprint of this, at least during the active fracking site. Nobody, and I think this is the key for the context I was working in, nobody disputes that this is an industrial process, right? That's key. Here's a little animation. You're going to see these black dots. This is the DFW Metroplex. We're on the edge of the Barnett Shale. The black dots are traditional horizontal wells before the advent of fracking. So the red dots coming in about now are those horizontal wells that are indicative of fracking. And you can see during the time leading up to my beginning of this research was about 2011. About 17,000 gas wells in the DFW region, many more in the surrounding area of Barnett Shale popped up. I wrote about this in my book eventually. What this created, because what's not on this animation, is the DFW Metroplex also growing and kind of growing westward into the shale. And so you had this collision of subterranean industrial mineral extraction interests and above the ground sort of community development interests. That was the clash that was the community engaged space that I occupied with this research. So what I did first is working with several local activists, is just to create this group that had no official status. We weren't a 501c3 or anything. And we did, they'll call this phase 1, 2011 to 2013. We did a lot of public education. So this is a poster from one of the things we put together where we brought in experts and community leaders to talk about their experiences and their knowledge about fracking. And we did a lot of policy advice because city council in the city of Denton, Texas was asking, what should our regulations for this process be? And so we wanted to create a forum where people could get input into that, where we could gather a lot of public input and do a lot of our own research. And then we wrote a couple of reports for city council to say, this is what we think the rules should be. And crucially, in this time period, we were addressing that clash through what I call the compatibility strategy. We weren't going to ban fracking. We were just looking for a way to make those two uses compatible, right? So it was a lot of detailed policy research around what are the powers of cities, right? What have other cities done? What kind of industrial best practices are out there so that we can mitigate the impacts on the community? And a lot of it had to do with proximity, as you might imagine, to where people live and work and play. But a lot of it had to do with sound mitigation. There was a lot of things to do with how the gases are vented and whether they can be captured. And so the ordinances would run several pages, and even our proposed revisions would run several pages, very detailed work we were doing to say this is what we think a responsible ordinance could look like. Its eventual failure, that is the failure of the compatibility strategy, came in 2013. This is where I have to gloss over a lot of the details. But the long story short is that for some reason, the city back, remember when all those red dots were coming online? Back in those days, the early 2000s, they were handing out plats to the fracking industry operators. These are essentially maps. They would be like 200 acres in size. And they would say, you can frack wherever you want in this plat, right? Well, once we passed the new ordinance that really tightened the regulations, the industry said, doesn't matter what you do in 2013 because we got a plat in 2007 and we're vested under those older rules. So that was a real big point of frustration. And then in 2013, a new fracking site went in 200 feet from a neighborhood. And despite our new regulations that everybody said city council passed 1,200 feet because they didn't have to listen to our regulations. So at that point, we decided as a group, after a lot of soul searching, to push for a ban on fracking because this is the only way that we're not going to make it compatible. And it's an industrial use that, unlike any other industrial use, invades these residential spaces, right? So it's just not going to work. So we started a campaign, and I love highlighting this slide because it was, we started Frack Free Denton, which was a 501c3 organization. I was the president of that organization. The opposition had a lot more money than us and started a counter group to kind of take their money in. And they had a website. This was really, they called it responsible drilling, which I felt like we had been trying to do, and they wouldn't listen to it. And this one was funny because on their website at one point, they said that I have direct connections to Russian government TV entity. And we're really trying to smear us as communists. It was really quite interesting. So the campaign got heated. And that's why I'm saying not every field philosophy project turns into something like this, but it might, And there's always going to be things that you don't quite anticipate happen. And maybe I should have done a better job anticipating. But we knew it was going to be a fight. We tried for a long time to avoid that by having this compatibility strategy. So that happened. That was a tense year. It was basically all of 2014. I would even do things like go to debates, packed house debates where it was me, like a philosophy professor, debating a slick PR guy from the oil industry. I learned a lot, say in that process. We won. This is a picture of the core group. That's Ed and Tara Lynn and Texas Sharon and Kathy and Rhonda and me. We got 59% of the vote, which is actually quite a landslide. And I think our messaging was really important because we never talked about fracking as an oil and gas extraction technique or as a climate change issue. We were talking about it as an incompatible land use with our community because that's what we hear, And even people who worked in the oil and gas industry voted for the ban because they thought this is ridiculous that we're doing it here. One guy said, yeah, I work in the oil fields, but when I get home, I take my boots off at the front door, like we're not doing that here. So I think we ran a really effective campaign somehow. And it had to do a lot with Tara Lynn, who's pictured there looking exhausted with the kind of scarf, who was a community organizer. And there's just so many skill sets that are important that I didn't have. I think, again, what I was pretty good at was some of the philosophical issues about framing what's going on in ways that a wide audience could understand. Right? Carol, who's not in this picture, said she thinks we won the ban because I made a postcard that said it had a picture of a fracking site, and we handed out the polling sites, and it said, we don't even allow bakeries in neighborhoods. Why do we allow this? It was kind of like a summation of our basic argument. But what ended up happening is we lost. This is me getting arrested in 2015 for trespassing because the state of Texas immediately started their legislative session. They saw the Denton fracking ban as a huge threat to the oil and gas industry. And they passed a bill called HB 40, which removes the power of municipalities to ban oil and gas drilling within their city limits. We thought that was an unjust law. This is me and Tara Lynn and Nikki, and several of us who supported this kind of direct action. That this was an active fracking site in the city of Denton. And our ban was still on the books at the time. So we decided we're going to go and just enforce our own ban, right? And we're going to block these trucks. And we sat there for quite a while with big trucks trying to get in and honking at us until the police hauled us away. So we did kind of lose, but what's interesting, I put maybe in parentheses because there's never been another fracking permit issued in the city of Texas. And one of the local reporters said to me, she suspects, although you never know, but really interested in impacts that we have, and it's hard to know what impacts you. She suspects it because we just made something, just made it so hard that they're like, we're not going to mess with that. So I don't know. Okay, so that's just a brief kind of window into one project that got a little out of hand, but was also very fulfilling in many ways and kind of humbling because I learned just how many people with different skill sets it takes to really wrestle with the community, an issue that's important to the community. So that's part two. Part three. Here is my kind of model in a slide or two of what field philosophy is. Again, just to kind of recap and put it in a different way. I think the problem is the discipline is exercising a radical monopoly on philosophy and its theory of knowledge production. And its theory of knowledge production is what counts as legitimate knowledge is peer-reviewed scholarship that passes by the purview of other experts. I don't have a problem with that. I'm a pluralist about things. I do think that's a great model, but it can't be the only one. So I'm kind of advocating for what you would call in civil engineering a complete street system approach. So you build a city street that it has places for cars, which would be like disciplinary philosophy, but you also allow sidewalks and bike lanes, so other modes of viewing philosophy. That's kind of what I'm trying to describe, was that we can think about other ways of producing knowledge or insights or help transfer. Here it is. So just in a few kind of bullet points. I think the goal of a field philosophy project is to help understand, articulate, and assess the ethics and values dimensions that are going on with whatever project you're interested in. The approach of it is case-based. You begin with the problems as defined by the stakeholders. Okay, you don't come in with your own sort of pre-framed ideas about what's going on. Your audience or your collaborators are going to be these, whoever it is out there working, right, in the community. It could be scientists, it could be engineers, it could be stakeholders in a neighborhood, it could be policymakers, it could be all of those. The methods are pluralistic and you can't know in advance. I learned a lot about how to figure out what gas wells are where by figuring out the software of the Texas Railroad Commission, which is what runs oil and gas in Texas. That became kind of a method for me, right? But I didn't know I was going to need that. You kind of have to just know what the context is. And then finally, how do you evaluate? This is what I'm most interested in. How do you evaluate whether it's good or bad research? The metrics for the disciplinary model are pretty simple. You just count peer-reviewed publications or your H index, how many times you've been cited. I'm interested in a broader set of alternative metrics than just that. Okay. Doing okay, I guess. Maybe 10 more minutes or so. Okay. What I want to do is show the model in my goofy or PowerPoint graphics. I want to call your attention. This is applied philosophy, which I'm trying to distinguish field philosophy from, right? So this is something different. This is still a disciplinary model, because people often hear field philosophy and they think applied, and I just want to I think there's a key distinction. So imagine this discipline here in the academy, and then imagine a problem in the world. Okay? And here comes your applied philosopher with their theories and their answers. So I'm a utilitarian or whatever, and this is the way I'm going to solve this problem. And what they do, though, is they kind of observe. They say, okay, this is going on out there. They're going to build these wind turbines in Nantucket Sound or something. Then you're going to say, oh, this is really all about something, right? This is all about aesthetics. And so you drain away all of the important context to hone in on your philosophic nugget. And then you take it back to your discipline where you do the intellectual work and you produce a peer-reviewed publication. So in my mind, that's kind of the applied philosophy model. Now, applied philosophers might then take their peer-reviewed publication and put it in the front of a policymaker or something. Now you're starting to make a move towards field philosophy. But insofar as this is all you're doing, I still think that's a disciplinary model, right? Although it may look like you're doing something engaged because you're talking about real world issues, you're not talking with the people involved in the real world issues, right? I really like this quote from Wolfgang Krohn. This is in an Oxford Handbook of Interdisciplinarity. Basically, he says, you're an academic, you're oftentimes interested in getting involved in these complex interdisciplinary projects. But then there's this need for a manageable object, right? Something that you can take to your disciplinary community and say, look, I did something. And it drives you right back out of it, right? So that's always been a challenge for interdisciplinarity, is how do you stay with the trouble, as it were? How do you stay with the problem so that your work is actually done where it's needed to be done? And I'm not saying I have the answers to that. I'm just trying to theorize that problematic. So this is the way I would do my Dept version of field philosophy in a PowerPoint slide. Notice I put little dashed lines here to try to indicate there's more porosity and intermingling here going on. You do have an issue in the world. Maybe it's fracking in Denton, Texas. Maybe it's a pipeline coming up to Maine. I don't know. But rather than coming with your answers, you come with your questions and your experience and open eyes and ears. So there's not going to be anybody else probably in this fray that has a philosophic background, right? Nobody's read Heidegger like you or whatever it is, right? If you're the philosopher coming in. So you have something to contribute, a unique perspective, right? But you don't just lump that on top. You come with that, that's your perspective. And you just try to learn the way it's being framed and talked about in the community. And you look for those moments where those little rhizomes pop up here or there somewhere where you can do something else, right? The important part is that you're not just observing, you're a participant, and that your intellectual work is done in media res, as it were, like in situ, right, with these folks. And it's not going to look like a peer-reviewed publication. You can also do that, and I do think that's important. But a lot of your work is going to be kind of done in the meetings or whatever it is that you're having. Then you can take your lessons learned and you can go back to your community of practitioners, your fellow field philosophers, right, or whoever. And you can reflect and improve and then kind of go back into the fray. So it is kind of what we call a circulatory model. Crucially, in this model, you're still housed in the academy and you have its protections for free speech. And the kind of autonomy in that sense, right? That's something maybe to talk about later. Okay. I'm gonna skip this one because I feel like I can come back. I have two last slides I just want to show you. So here's my agenda. Here's what I'd say. Right now, I'd say disciplinary philosophers constitute something like 95%. There's a few oddballs out there, but there's way too much of that. I'd like to cut that down to 50%. If somebody made me the czar of academic philosophy, right? And they could do a wide range of things, and they should. The other 50%, I'd like to experiment, right? So this is like taking half of the cars off the roads, and let's have electric bikes and people walking and scooters. Let's have other ways of doing it. And then I split up that other half into what I'm calling public philosophers and resident philosophers. That I used to call that last category philosopher bureaucrats, but that was universally hated. Nobody liked that term. So now I'm trying resident philosophers. They would be housed outside of the academy. That's the key point. See, this is a philosophy of philosophy that's focused on institutions and audiences. Like who do you work with? They would be like your Google ethics person, right? They would be out in the private sector or in the non-government sector or in the public sector. That's where I think the pushing a rope is the hardest. It's really hard to get philosophers in those positions. But I feel like there's a future there. Then your public philosophers are housed in the academy. So they are ideally protected by the one good thing I think about disciplinary standards is this free speech protections that come from the university. And then I can imagine this is just kind of a range of things you could do. There's popular philosophers who take philosophy to cafes, they write blogs, they have pop-up booths, ask a philosopher, just kind of like interesting creative things you could do. You can do public philosophy as a pedagogical practice, taking students out to the field or an internship-based program, or you can build it into your curriculum on the inside. And then what I mostly work on is interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, that's ID and TD. That's where I would put field philosophy as a kind of research that's inter and transdisciplinary. And then Paul Thompson, who I think retired now at Michigan State, works with farmers and ag bureaus of all sorts. He called it occasional philosophy. I like that because he says you philosophize as the occasion arises. And he does a lot of good work with sort of food ethics with a lot of different stakeholders. So you can call it, I guess, whatever you want. Here's my last slide of my just kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall agenda of things that might be fun to try or think about. One stage setting point, I am talking about in part the accountability culture that I think all universities are feeling, and especially, at least it seems to me, the humanities. What good is a philosophy degree, right? We see philosophy degrees as a percentage of all degrees declining. I think we can answer that question in a way that doesn't mean selling out, whatever that might mean. That's the kind of jujitsu I'm trying to do here. What could we do? Well, I think we can look abroad, because I think in some sense, when it comes to the accountability culture, that the EU and the UK is ahead of us. I really like in the UK, their model is pathways to impact. So if you're a scholar, you need to map out what is the goal of your research, who do you want to reach, what transformation you want to make happen, what values are going on. And then you have to lay out how are you going to get there? Like, who do you need to speak with? What do you need to learn? And I feel like we don't have that kind of thoughtfulness necessarily built in to a lot of the research we do. So I kind of like that. Although again, that could be perceived as and maybe really be a threat to your autonomy to do kind of what you want to do. But I also think it can be a moment for you to get more thoughtful about your autonomy. I'd like to experiment with the 110 PhD philosophy programs we were talking about this. There's too many of them probably. There's just a glut. But that also means maybe there's an opportunity for some of them to specialize in training students in how to do fieldwork, right? Why not? Seems like it would be possible. I'd like to develop new counts of rigor. It's a different kind of hard. It's hard to write a peer-reviewed philosophy journal article. I'm not very good at it. I would get rejected. It's a different kind of hard to like wrangle a bunch of squirrely activists around kind of an agenda that we think is in the community good. And it's also hard to listen to policymakers tell you why your ideas won't work and then kind of go back to the drawing board. That's a kind of rigor We need new metrics for success. I could talk about that a lot more. New accounts of who counts as our peers. I think that's the most fundamental thing I'm talking about. I put the mayor here because the mayor of the city of Denton, I made sure was one of my external letter review, letter writers for my tenure review. So I said, that's my peer community. I want to know if the mayor thought what we were doing was useful. And the university put up with me in doing that, right? Sometimes if you just ask them, why don't we, and I think this maybe happens more than it used to, second, that is kind of put humanists around the academy. Why do they have to live in their own department? I've asked at UNT, can I spend 5 years with engineering and just kind of be a fly on the wall or maybe some kind of a participant with what they're doing there? See if I could be helpful in any projects they're working. And they're like, no, oh my God, we can never do that. But I don't see why not. I like what ASU is doing, Arizona State University, as far as I understand. The whole university, why is it built around a disciplinary ontology? Why don't we just build it around problems? You know, I mean, I think the sustainability center is a model for that. But let's just have water or whatever it is you want to do. And then you bring in all these different perspectives on that. And that becomes your locus rather than these sort of different knowledge communities. And then my last one, I think we need a new code of ethics for this kind of community engaged research. And I bet if we look at anthropology, we find it there because in some fields they've been doing this for a long time. But in philosophy, at least, this is pretty new. And so I felt like I could have often used guidance on what's the right thing to do in various contexts where you're sort of outside the boundaries of typical academia. So that, I think there's a big agenda of stuff we could work on. This is just some of the ideas. But I'll wrap it up there. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. So I have a question on your so I relate a lot with your content because I do studio arts in more like, you know, I want to call myself interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, but there's a lot of, we have talked about a lot of gatekeeping. And I'm sure in philosophy or in a lot of departments or fields, there's a lot of that where like you want to get engaged with the problem, but it doesn't apply to the field or things like that, or you want to study it because it affects your community, yourself, but then it doesn't qualify for your field. And then you are put in this like environmentalist, activist, right? Not a philosopher. So how do you, or what are your strategies for that? Or what kind of things have you done when I'm sure you have encountered those things.
A great question. I mean, one, I don't know if this gets to exactly what you're asking, so stop me if it doesn't, but one thing I was thinking about, I didn't mention, is your tenure promotion standards in your department need to become philosophic documents in their own right to account for the way you valorize different kinds of activities so that, I mean, I think that's, if the discipline is a social construct, that's the way I think of it. We're not carving nature at the joints here, right? We're sort of creating these economic, political communities. That means they can be constructed in different ways. And one of the key leverage points is those documents and their bylaws that say what counts as excellence in our field. So I think that's a key point to intervene on. Does that help? Is that?
Yeah. And yes, because again, it is like especially when in academia where you have to provide proof that they have decided it is proof, right? And like organizing in the community is not proof that qualifies for what they have decided is something.
True, but it's also an occasion, if you have a welcoming faculty, right, to think critically about who we want to be, what is excellence for us. Because I have found that faculty autonomy is still really strong there, because whatever you come up with as a rating system in your field, when it goes up to the college level and beyond, all they do is count. Okay, they have X number of whatevers, because they don't really know. So, yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
It's a very strange question, but it was more about like asking about more details about exactly. Okay, how do I phrase it? What exactly did you do when you're you're part of the community, you're working with these projects? How did you use your philosophy background in these projects?
Good. I'm glad you asked that. It's not strange. In fact, I had a slide that I cut. I think that's a really important question. So, two-part answer to that. One is it's a hard question to answer because it presupposes there's something that counts as philosophy that we can pull out and identify. And that's part of maybe what I'm challenging, right? But that's not a very satisfying answer. So part two, I would say, if I try to give a philosophical, what philosophy I was doing in the free stuff.
Well, I mean, what I mean is more like how did you use your formal philosophy education? But yeah, that's rephrasing that.
Yeah, no, I got you.
Hi, Adam, could you repeat the question, please?
Oh, question. How did you use your formal philosophy training in the sort of field philosophy work that you do? Let me just give an example that's a little more targeted. So I look at one of the essays that's had a profound impact on me is Heidegger's Question Concerning Technology, which we're talking about. The hard one to read, but once you kind of take it on board, it really, at least in my experience, helps you see the world anew. So coming in, looking at fracking, thinking about Heidegger's categories of in-framing and Bestand, and then looking at a railroad commission map, it became apparent to me that this is the state of Texas has an in-framing way of looking at this. We're kind of an energy production node in a network, right? And the city of Denton has a more community-oriented perspective. And from that basic insight then, like in the meetings that we have, I was able to lay out kind of, here's the fundamentally different ontologies going on here, the different worldviews. And then that's kind of, it's hard to explain in the abstract, but it led to the ways in which we try to build bridges across those to make those compatible. But I felt like, again, that's only one contribution. Everybody else had their contribution. But I did feel like that was helpful because I saw a lot of people see, oh, I was wondering, like, what is it that this is all about? Like it was kind of inchoate and half felt. And then when I could lay it out in that way, it helped us produce the way we framed our message and our policy recommendations on all of that. So that's just one example.
That's cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you think there would be some unexpected challenges for disciplinary philosophers to kind of leave that kind of beautiful world of knowledge production at times to kind of bridge with public philosophy, kind of connects with this other kind of meaningful world, right? So what would be those challenges of leaving, kind of branching out from the disciplinary philosophy to kind of reach out towards a more community engaged type of philosophy?
Good. So the question is, what are the challenges that philosophers would feel or encounter as they attempt to do a more community-oriented version of scholarship? I think the biggest one is a loss of control, because in many ways I'm kind of a disciplinarian at heart because I like my single authored publications where all the ideas are mine, and I can sort of organize them how I want on my own timeline. If you really engage with this kind of scholarship, you're not driving the bus, and I think that's a big challenge I've noticed for a lot of philosophers because we have a kind of libertarian culture of philosophers. We're kind of like, this is my bailiwick, I'm the expert here, and I do everything here. So to step into the fray and say, I'm just one voice among many is difficult. And then I'll just say one other one, which I think is related, is learning how to kind of shuck and jive and go with the flow of the conversation, and to see how your ideas are maybe being said but in a different way, and then knowing when to latch onto something and say, aha, here's a moment where I could offer something helpful. So that kind of context specific reading of the room, as it were, for the situation is another challenge. Because nobody teaches us how to do that. Yeah. Is that Alex?
It is, good to see you. Thank you for the talk and for poking holes in the side of philosophy. Not there, please. So looking at this sort of outline of field philosophy you've given, I'm wondering if it can be used in non-ethical, like sort of aethical situations. So I think we all see the bridge of philosophy out of ethics, political, like we can have the value conversation, but I think there might be more to philosophy that can leave. And wondering sort of what you see as the room for philosophy beyond ethics to step into the field.
Oh, okay. Let me repeat it, make sure I'm getting your question, because it wasn't quite what I thought you were asking. So you're asking what kind of field philosophy wouldn't be ethics focused, but would pick up on other aspects of philosophy?
Yeah, so like what are other roles the philosopher can go out into the world and perform and share beyond the sort of ethical value laden situation?
This is interesting. So yeah, what are other roles philosophers can do beyond sort of ethics and values stuff? This may be a kind of deformation in the way I talk about it. So Bob Prodeman and I early on decided we're going to use the ethics and values because that's the sort of term of art in NSF and sort of broader scientific and engineering communities that will at least get heads nodding like, oh yeah, that's ethics and values. We always thought that could be a Trojan horse for wider things, right? Beyond what you might narrowly prescribe as ethics and values. So the wind farm example is one where I walked in and thinking ethics and values, but it actually was aesthetics. But then again, values to me captures a lot because those are aesthetic values, right? So I don't know if you're asking beyond like axiology.
I guess, could we do this without a problem?
Oh, interesting. Okay, could we do this without a problem? I guess not in the way I framed it. It's very much a problem-oriented form of research, but I'm not sure. That's a good question. Yeah.
Could I just, I'm going to save my questions for the next hour, but I know that Linda Silka, who's on the screen, has represent some of the stuff coming in from the virtual audience. Is it okay to call on Linda for?
Sure. I think you want to jump into, but maybe
I can wait as well.
after. Yeah, go ahead.
What a great talk. What an interesting talk that helps us all think about a lot of different things. So it is, we just want to thank you for that. And we really want to follow you around. So if we followed you around, because we want to see how you're doing all this, if we followed you around on a typical day, not that there's a typical day, what might we see in terms of, are you sitting in an office? Are you talking to people out in Horsefield? How can we understand what your typical day might be like?
Okay, good. Yeah. So I have since become more of an administrator than I want to be. So unfortunately, my typical day is in front of emails. But I'm going to read your question as a field philosopher's typical day. And that is the best way to frame it. And Bob and I early on said, why is it that we're always in an office? What is so I talk about the opportunity space. I could have said, why is it that our space is like this desk, And so yeah, if you follow somebody around, they're gonna be sometimes in the office, sure, but they're gonna be going to where the action is. So when I was actively involved in this, you could find me at the Greenhouse, which was a supportive restaurant where we had all of our community meetings. I'd be down at City Hall almost all the time. I went off to neighbors' houses who were claiming they had water wells issues because of fracking, and I talked to them. I went with the industry representatives several times to their offices and out to the field to actually see inside of those fracking trucks and stuff like that. So everywhere you could go to learn about the issue so that you can do a better job contributing to it.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. One of the things that is always so interesting in academia is how are your students taking in what you're engaging them on? So what kinds of responses have you gotten from your students in their writings, in their comments, and the questions they ask? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, good question. So my students are all across the board. So some of them say this isn't real philosophy. How is this philosophy? There's certainly those. Some of them say this doesn't go far enough, right? You're still sort of beholden to this sort of academic jargon, right? And we need to blow up the whole system, right? And then there's some in the middle who are like, yes, this is what I was looking for. I want to be engaged in ways where there's some sort of model or methodology that can guide it, and I still feel like it can be valorized as an academic activity, you know? So it is across the board, but it's all in good spirit, and we have really good conversations about all of those topics, I would say.
I think we're all really impressed. Thank you. We're all really impressed with the titles of some of your work, like Field Philosophy as Engaged Research, Practice, History, and Theory, and just some of the others. What have been the responses to your writings? Do you hear from community people or policy people as well as people who are in academia? And are there things you're learning from that?
Yeah, that's good too. Yeah, and I think one of the metrics of success is that you do hear from people out in the community, because it means that you're starting to get known. I think you have to build up a reputation as somebody who can be trusted, somebody who has some measure of authority around this, that they're not going to confer on you automatically because you're a philosopher, because again, people think philosophy doesn't have anything to do with this. So that's a long sort of patient game of building up credibility. One of my favorite stories, though, is talking about people's feedback that I got. During the fracking debate, there was a multi-million-dollar donor to the University of North Texas, and he went straight to our president and he said, I'm not giving you any more money unless you fire Briggle. So I remember taking that as, well, okay, I'm getting somebody's attention. And then later on, the state legislature, when our president was down there, lobbying for funding, the legislature said the same thing to him, said, you got a problem with this Briggle guy. And to his credit, he stood up for me in academic freedom of speech, but he relayed those stories to me. He was frustrated, but he didn't ever tell me or command me to back down. So
that is just so interesting. Thank you for sharing that with us. We all have heard so much the term fracking, and until your talk today, I never really knew what fracking was. And part of what was interesting about your full talk is there were all kinds of different pieces where things that we thought we knew, we realized, oh, wow, we're just kind of floating around. We don't quite know. And so thank you for that help. Right now in Maine, of course, wind turbines, you mentioned wind turbines. That's one of the things we're really struggling a lot with, the whole issue of our shared ocean and what's going to happen, and what's happening to the lobsters with the wind turbines, and what's happening in terms of all these different things. if we had you here, what would you recommend that we do?
Who's we?
Maine. It could be the state, the university, the people who are doing the fishing, all the people who care about our shared ocean.
I'm gonna have to plead ignorance and say I'm not in a position to recommend anything. I would be fascinated to learn and think with you, but
Great, great.
Yeah.
We have a special issue of the Maine Policy Review that's going to come out that's called Our Shared Ocean, where we're trying to bring those different arguments and pieces together. So, oh, thank you for providing us with all this thoughtful information about how we can approach our disciplines, how we can approach working with other disciplines, how we can approach working with partners, how we can understand that rigor has a lot of different meanings and we need to pay attention to that, and how we can keep learning and trying things. So everybody, can we give we've run out of time, but can we give our speaker a wonderful thank you and hands?